goes way the heck out into the Gulf of Mexico, right? Down around 600 feet is considered the break, and it drops right on down. Over on the East Coast, down there by Fort Lauderdale, it doesn't go out very far. It's 2,000 feet deep right off of there. Almost all of that is limestone. A heck of a lot of what this talk is going to be about is limestone, because it's like one of the controlling influences on the surface of Florida, and that includes the lakes, many of the lakes. Next. A nice satellite photograph. If you look down at the Bahama archipelago, all that white beach-looking stuff, that is one of the most stable and impressive carbonate banks in the world. When I say carbonate, I'm referring to limestone, basically. Calcium carbonate. They have drilled exploratory wells in the Bahamas. The deepest one is over 19,000 feet deep. They have not got to the bottom of the limestone yet. Now, they bring up cores when they do this, and they examine them, right? The geologists are keenly interested in being around when these exploratory wells are being drilled, a lot of them for oil and gas exploration. And they still haven't hit what they consider the basement rocks, which are going to be sandstone, some sort of metamorphic rock, or igneous rocks, what they call the crystalline rocks. Over in Florida, oh, by the way, these channels in the Bahamas, these are some of the deepest gorges or canyons in the world. This is the tongue of the ocean. This baby's 6,000 feet deep. The New Providence Channel through this area is over 10,000 feet deep. It really makes the Grand Canyon pale. The sides of these things are almost vertical. I've dove out here and gone down like 300 feet. It's just dropping straight. Somewhere down there it slopes out, right? But it's quite an impressive carbonate bank. Well, Florida's a carbonate bank also. For the longest time it was underwater. It was part of Pangaea, the old supercontinent. Things drifted around. They drifted to different latitudes. But for many, many millions of years, probably about 55 million years, back to the beginning of the Eocene, Florida was a shallow carbonate bank, like most of the Bahamas is right now. All this stuff is shallow, limestone-forming banks. And it forms by various processes, but it's all marine. So next slide. At a certain point, back in the Miocene, which would have been 20 million years ago or so, Florida started coming in and out of the ocean. Oceans were going up and down. So part of the time it was still a shallow carbonate bank forming limestones. And part of the time it started being influenced by the erosion of the stuff to the north, in particular the Appalachian Mountains. Those were huge mountains at one time, bigger than the Himalayas, right? And they're all worn down now, and a lot of that stuff is sitting on top of Florida. Our sand, some people, Florida has been referred to as a giant sandbar on top of the limestone. And that's silica sand. And it flowed down and made deltaic deposits, and longshore drift is still carrying that stuff down onto the beaches of Florida. They covered up almost the entire state with clays and what they call siliclastics, various kinds of sand. But one of the big events was the formation of what they call the Hawthorne Formation, named after our nice little town. That's where it was first described by the geologists. And what it is, it's a big chunk of clay. Right here, it's probably about 150 feet deep underneath us. And it's thick, it's very resistant to the movement of water. Up on the loose sands on the top of the Hawthorne. Water moves through that at the rate of up to like 20 inches an hour. So I mean it just sifts right on through. But when it hits the Hawthorne, it comes to a screeching halt. It moves very, very slowly, maybe 100th of an inch an hour after that. And next slide. So the Hawthorne Formation pretty much blanketed all of Florida at one time, those clays. Well, a lot of it's been completely worn away. From Gainesville off to the west, towards Newberry, the Hawthorne Formation is gone. In fact, there's an escarpment called the Acadia Escarpment. It doesn't look like an old Tarzan movie, right, with the vertical cliff with dinosaurs on top. This escarpment's anywhere from 2 to 6 miles wide, but it's a Florida style escarpment. And to the east of it is what we call the Northern Highlands. That's where we are. When you leave Gainesville and let's say you drive out near the Highway Patrol Station, you get up to like 170 feet of elevation, you're up on the Northern Highlands. My house, I'm down on one of the creeks in town, Possum Creek, and we're at 90 feet elevation. So the hawthorn's being stripped away by these creeks. And out towards Newberry, it's completely gone. So all you've got is limestone with a thin little veneer of sand over the top of it. But this is the Trail Ridge. And this is a huge shoreline feature. You notice it's coast parallel. This is an old shoreline. These are basically sand dunes and sandbars. So at one time the oceans were up higher. Just like we're forming sand dunes and sandbars at the present day coastline, these things formed a long time ago, like, back in the Pliocene, which would be 2 million years ago, these things were forming. And it's topographically high. In this area, it gets all the way up to 270 feet, 280 feet. One of the highest places on the Trail Ridge, in fact, the highest place, is called Sugarloaf Mountain. And it's down near Lake Apopka. It's 315 feet high. That's the highest place on the peninsula. The next highest place is where Bok Tower and Bok Gardens is. That little hill is 310 feet high. Big sand dunes. Your lake, here's the Grandin Mine. So your lake sits here on the east side of the Trail Ridge. And the drainage on the east side of this ridge goes towards the Gulf. And even though it's a lot closer to the Atlantic, that ridge has washed that drainage in that direction. And all those sandhill lakes, in fact, we used to refer to this as the lake region. Many of us still do. And it goes all the way down to Lake Wales. In fact, if you look at aerial photographs of this, there's a beautiful little spit down here, just like you get on barrier islands today when the longshore currents are washing stuff down, and there's often a little hook at the bottom. You can see that on there. You can see it when you're flying over it. It's pretty cool. But that's where it dies out. That's where Florida really gets low and flat, right? This all was underwater, prior to about 5,000 years ago. And in the wet periods, the entire state of Florida, below this point, pretty much used to go underwater, with small exceptions. But anyhow, let's go to the next slide. One of the high stands of sea level, 150 feet, and this is what was left of Florida. It's a string of islands. So most of it was underwater. And there's the old shoreline. You know, 10,000 years, 12,000 years ago, the shoreline was way out here. We've been diving a sinkhole that's out about here, about 30 miles out, and we figure about 8,000 years ago was when the ocean was lapping at that sinkhole. And of course, the holy grail of archaeology is to find an Indian site out there, a burial mound, a pile of chips and flakes and arrowheads. They actually have some over in the Tallahassee area, on the Osceola River, about just a couple of miles out, maybe 2 miles out. There's a couple of Indian sites. So they were out there, and they retreated with the advancing water. Okay, next slide. This is the Trail Ridge. Look at that steep hill. Bicyclists, it's real rural. This is around Lake Apopka. This is Sugarloaf Mountain. And they love this hill, but they all complain about it. It's a hill and a half. And it's quite a view from the top. You can see Lake Apopka. You can see all over the place. Next slide. If you cut into these hills, this is from the Grandin Mine right nearby. If you cut into these things, you can see cross-bedding. There's no doubt what this is. Here's a flat layer, here's a layer coming this way, here's a layer coming this way. That's sand dune deposition. You can go to the beach right now, and if you can find somewhere they won't arrest you, take your shovel and just cut a vertical face, and you'll see that cross-bedding. Next slide. And the gist of all this is what we got now. Here's that Trail Ridge I was talking about, and it carries right on down. And this is the Northern Highlands. Lake Santa Fe is right up here, nestled into the kind of right up in the corner of the Trail Ridge. Up on the Northern Highlands, And the Northern Highlands, that's where all the clay is, right? The Miocene uplands. Over here, west of Gainesville, is where you've got limestone exposed. Next slide. But there's some problems with what the geologists have been thinking for 150 years. One, this is a cross-section of the peninsula, highly squished together, right? Highly stretched out. And this is the top of the Trail Ridge. That's like 70 meters. What's that, 210 feet or something above sea level? And then there's other shorelines. These are all what they call beach ridges or terraces. And as the ocean drops down, often it will stall at a certain elevation. And it'll cut a new beach right there. Now, if it rises again, it'll obliterate that last beach, right? Anything that was formed before. But when you get a falling sea level that's continuous, it starts cutting these benches in the side of the ridge. And they've identified, oh, depending on who you talk to, you know, there may be three benches or 7 benches. They still argue about this stuff. But anyhow, these things are up pretty darn high. Like here's one of them at 40 meters. But if you go over here and look at sea level history, and this history has been gleaned from stuff all over the world, not just right here in Florida. That 0 is sea level. And it's gone way down. Here's the 100-meter line, down below 100 meters. We know for a fact it's been down 400 feet during the ice ages, because you can go over to the Bahamas and dive down in those caves, and there's stalactites hanging from the ceiling at 400 feet deep. They don't form underwater. They have to be in the air. So we know that the oceans have been down 400, and they got real good proof about how high they got. It's only about 25, maybe 50 meters at the most. And we're talking 60, 70 meters up here on these ridges. Well, if the ocean only got to 20 or 30 meters higher than it is now, how did we get these ridges up so high? Next slide. Well, here's the probable answer. Limestone has what they call a specific gravity. That's a measure of density of about 2.2. We are mostly water and a few minerals, so we're like 1.000 something. Water is 1 by definition, so we compare density. Everything is compared against water. And what they think has happened is that there's been so much solution of limestone. And by solution, I mean the stuff is, water is running down through it, right? It dissolves it just like you dissolve sugar in a glass of tea. And it runs on out, and it goes out of springs, and it gets carried out to the ocean. And they've actually done, it's been done several times now, where guys have looked at springs. The last really good one was a guy looked at 100 springs, and he could measure the amount of, they got good records on how much calcium carbonate is coming out, right? Dissolved limestone. And they know how much water is coming out. And so he took all those things, and he calculated how much water is dissolving out of the interior of Florida, inside, down there, and being carried away. And it comes up to something like 1.2 million cubic meters a year. To put that into perspective, a really big dump truck is about 10 or 12 cubic yards. Cubic meters more than a cubic yard. Now we're talking about 1.2 million every year. So Florida is being eaten from the inside out, kind of like a tree with beetles. So what they think has happened is there's been so much dissolving away of the rock, which is heavy relative to the water, and then the water replaces that. These are water-filled cavities that the whole thing does what they call isostatic rebound. It becomes lighter, and so the thing just starts floating up. This same process is going on right now in the Adirondack Mountains in New York. The great ice sheets were over that, a mile thick or so. And when they retreated, the Adirondacks was squished down, right, deeper into the earth. And when they retreated, it started rising up, and it's still rising today. And this is probably the best explanation for why these sand ridges are up so high, higher than they ought to be. They would call that an anomaly. Let's see, next slide. Let's just, hold on a second. This is a cross-section, kind of maybe 50 miles or so south of the Georgia border, coming from way over in the Panhandle. But the point here is, this is all limestone. There's tons of this stuff around Gainesville, and here it's about 600 meters of that stuff thick. And as you get further down, like around Volusia County, there's 1,500 meters. That's almost 5,000 feet of this limestone. And this limestone is pretty much pure. When we dive down there in this stuff, you don't see layers of sand in the limestone. It just ain't there. Any sand that's in those caves washed in from outside. So the limestones were formed in a condition where there just wasn't any sand available to be incorporated into the rock. Okay. Oh, here we have the Trail Ridge. So your lake's sitting right about here. And it's sitting up on the Hawthorne Formation. That's what this stuff is. Here's the Swanee River. And it's cut all the way through it, right? And actually, if we were further south down at our latitude, we'd see a lot of this hawthorn is gone. Until you hit Gainesville, and you climb right up a little hill. And in fact, the Med Center Hill and all those other big hills in Gainesville, the 8th Avenue Hill, they're climbing up onto the northern highlands. That's the escarpment. Okay, next. And if you think there ain't some solution going on in the heart of Florida, check this slide out. This is a sinkhole in Polk County. This thing formed in a gypsum stack, so it's phosphate mines, right? They have this spoil that they pile up in big, huge stacks. I mean, 100 feet high, right? There used to be one down there. My dad was an airline pilot. When he took off from Tampa, the locals called it Sand Mountain. And when my dad said, if you take off, the first thing you see is Sand Mountain over there in the distance. So the whole entire gypsum stack went down the tubes. And I've gotten conflicting reports on this. I've always heard it was 400 feet deep, but I've heard anywhere from 120 to 400. It's 160 feet across. That's a tremendous amount of material. That means there was just a god-awful cavity down underneath for all that stuff to collapse down into. So Florida is indeed being eaten from the inside out. Okay, next slide. Another shot of the same thing. I had a geologist friend who was dying to get down into that thing. He got with the phosphate people and said, we really know what we're doing. We're cavers. We can get down there. They weren't having anything to do with that. I was quite relieved when they said we couldn't go. Anyhow, next slide. And here they've got the safety fence, right? And they've been pushing stuff down in there. I guess they filled the thing up. Or maybe not. And after this thing went down, you don't hear anything about it anymore. Everybody was waiting for this stuff to show up in some of the springs down that way. You're down there, you're getting kind of away from the springs. They're petering out. And like Kissingen Spring was the first magnitude spring down there. My dad used to swim in it. He grew up in Winter Haven. And the phosphate industry sucked so much water out of the ground that Kissingen Spring completely dried up. And they may have actually dug it down and got into one of its channels and stopped the flow also. But next slide. And this is just a little medley of slides here to show you how impressive this business of solution of limestone can be. This is in Guatemala City. How'd you like to step out your, were you coming down the road? I think a few people died in this one. Next slide. Another shot of that. That's going on down here underneath us. Like Devil's Millhopper's a big old hole in the ground, right? And generally the cavities down there are bigger than what fills them because it's loose when they fill it up. Next slide. This is the Great Belizean Blue Hole on that coral area off of the coast of Belize in the Caribbean. That's 460 feet deep, something like that. So these things are huge. So next one. And we can't leave out the Great Winter Park Sinkhole. I think that was 1988. Is anybody working on that? But anyhow, this is an Olympic swimming pool. There was a Porsche dealership over here somewhere. There's Porsches down in there. There's a car right there. There's a truck going down. There's a house or something. That's in the Orlando area, Winter Park. And if you look at well logs, these drillers, when they drill wells, they're required to keep logs on them. And it's like, okay, we got out of the sand here, we get limestone at this depth. And what they found is in the Orlando area, down around 300 feet, fully 50% of the wells that they sink into the ground are running into cavities that have a mean diameter of about 12 feet. So it's just riddled down there. And we think the fact that there's so many of them at that one level has something to do with the fact when the oceans were much further down, the saltwater, freshwater interface may have been that deep. And when you mix those two together, it dissolves limestone like crazy. And it's a complicated little chemistry thing that I just don't know if I really understand, but it's true. And that's probably why there are so many of them down there at that depth. And that's probably where this thing went into. So there's a big hole in the ground down there, or was. Okay, next slide. This slide really kind of sums it up for Lake Santa Fe. If we start over here on the far side, that's the Swanee River. And you come working this way, and you've got limestone at the surface, and just this thinnest amount of sand, until you hit this. This is another one of those old beach ridges, right? It runs north and south. This is called the Brooksville Ridge. There's another piece a little further to the north called the Bell Ridge. They're up there. They're old dune fields. And you head on over this way, and they've got this called Hogtown Prairie. That's over there near where the sinkhole is, where Gainesville's water treatment plant, sewage treatment plant is. That might as well be Paynes Prairie. Paynes Prairie would just be bigger, but it's got limestone in the bottom. It's still right in the limestone. It's got sinkholes in the bottom. And right now, Paynes Prairie has an active sink. It's called the Alachua Sink, and water flows quite briskly into that thing. The way Paynes Prairie formed, at one time, it was these hawthorn sediments. And like I mentioned, right at the edge of Gainesville is where you climb up into the northern highlands. At one time, Paynes Prairie might have looked like this, just an individual sinkhole. Well, these sinkholes will breach the confining layer, the layer that doesn't want water to move through it, right? So if you get some solution, you breach the confining layer. Now you capture local drainage, so you get more water coming down here, and you get more solution of limestone. It kind of concentrates in a certain spot, and then you get another one forming nearby, and then you get a swarm of them. And in fact, if you around the Alachua Sink, if you walk around in the woods up there on the rim of the prairie, it's what 30 or 40 feet higher than the bottom of the prairie. There's just one gigantic sinkhole after another. Most of them are clogged. The only real active one is Alachua Sink. Oh, back around 2000, we had a big drought, and I had a friend over at Paynes Prairie, and he called me up and says, "Come on over and dive Alachua Sink." He said, "It's as clear as Isostatic Springs." Well, that was a stretch. Me and two other guys and I went over, and we had our scuba gear, right? We went down and we took a look at the sinkhole, and there were probably 30 alligators in there. Well, we sat there for an hour and a half with some of the rangers, just looking and making sure there were no big guys there. At 7 feet, 6, 7 feet, I weigh more than they do, unfortunately. But anyhow, we watched for the longest time. We didn't see any big alligators, so we decided to go for it. And all the secretaries came down out of the office to watch us get in and out of the alligators. They were sorely disappointed. But it was 65 feet deep, and the one we were in was a dead sinkhole. There was a little cave down at the bottom, and there were alligator footprints all over the bottom, the tail drag marks, and they've been even going in and out of that little cave. I've seen them in these places before. They'll just go down there in the winter and sit there, right? They feel kind of safe and protected. And but it was hydrologically inactive. Well, right over a sandbar. I mean, this place is really low at this time. There's a sandbar had formed between this sink and the active sink. And the active sink really looked like a crack, about 30 feet long and about maybe 6 feet wide. And we went over to there, and we were standing there planning our next dive, and we were all looking down into the water, and up comes about a 12-foot alligator. About this far below the surface, he spotted us. Well, that dive ended. You know, he went right back down, not even getting a breath. Well, that dive was over before it started. But that water, nobody knows exactly where it's going, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the potentiometric surface, or the artesian surface, or if you go back even further, the piezometric surface. It's a really important thing for studying aquifers and where the water is, where the water goes. that sort of thing. But back to our diagram here. This is, by the way, the potentiometric surface is running right along here. And what that is, if you drill a well down into this limestone from up here, as you start going down dip on this limestone, it's like having a hose, and you put water in one end, put your finger over the other end, right? And you start building pressure up the more water you put in that hose. Well, that's what's happening here with this limestone. Water's entering in over here, like a natural sink, Hogtown Prairie sink, and it's filling this up. It's running downhill, and it's under pressure now, and it can't be relieved because of all the clay over its head until you drill a well down into it. And in the old days in Florida, there were lots of places where you could punch a well in the ground and you got a flowing well. Water just came out for free. You didn't have to pump it. Over around Hastings, where all the potato fields are, that whole area is an area where you could get flowing wells, and they all used to use those. Now they've taken so much water out of the ground that none of the wells flow. The water still rises up a certain distance in those well pipes, but it doesn't make it to the surface on a flowing well. Here's Lake Santa Fe. It's sitting right up on top of all this Hawthorne Formation, and then there's these sands and stuff. These are like what they call Pleistocene. The last million years or so, all the sand and stuff came down. But it's not the same as over here. It's a little different. There's more clay and stuff in this. And there's the Hawthorne is not pure clay. There's oyster beds in there. There's little limestone layers. And I'm still scratching my head as to exactly how Lake Santa Fe formed. And I've never read anybody who's speculated even. It could be that one of these limestone units in the Hawthorne Formation dissolved away, and you got slumpage at the surface. And in fact, the very last slide we're going to look at is a Lake Santa Fe and the Little Lake, and boy, they look like sinkholes, you know, from above. They could be some sort of a backwater area when the ocean was here. There could be slumpage for other reasons. There's just a whole number of things it could be, and we just don't know. But the important thing with this lake has this really stable water level compared to, what, 2 miles away? Over there at Lake Geneva, this is the closest one, Geneva. The reason is, this lake does not have a good connection with this aquifer down here. This aquifer goes up and down with rainfall. You know, we used to always think that, well, if you ever went on the glass bottom boats at Silver Springs, they told you that water was coming from the Smoky Mountains, right? It's a long way off. Well, not really. It's got a big old watershed, about 800 square miles, the Silver River does, and it really comes almost up to here. And so when water landing in that watershed soaks into the ground and it ends up going out in Silver Springs, it flows through the limestone. But anyhow, you don't have a good connection with the limestone here. So, and your main water source, you really don't have any creeks to go into this thing, right, that amount to anything, any rivers. It's seepage out of these sandy hills right around here. And they're quite extensive. Most of it's pine flatwoods, what you typically get on the northern highlands. So it loses water by evaporation, and when it gets to a certain level, it can flow out through the Santa Fe Swamp and into the Santa Fe River. So, but if you go over here, this is Levy's Prairie. How many people have been to Levy's Prairie? Now I'm talking about the one over, if you head, yes, down by the Boy Scout camp. Okay, that's a sinkhole. And that's a doozy of a sinkhole, right? And this is it. The fellow who wrote this paper studied this one in particular because it's got a connection with the aquifer. This guy's name is Kelly Brooks, and lots of geologists sit in their boats and they drop things on strings with grabbing jaws and pull sediments up, but they don't die, right? It's like, oh, we don't do that. But Kelly Brooks did, and he dove everywhere. And he dove in this darn thing, which I was impressed. Anyhow, we found a limestone conduit down here. It is blocked off with sediments a little ways down, but it's there. And the potentiometric surface is running up here. That's where if you put a well, that water would go right to that point right there. So it's coming right smack to the bottom of Levy's Prairie. that's what, we can get into stuff about the base level of erosion. Everything's wanting to erode down to that level and fill into that level. Compare that with Lake Santa Fe. There's no connection whatsoever. So when the Florida aquifer declines in pressure, declines in level, this goes down. Lake Santa Fe doesn't. So if you had a well right over here and drilled it into the limestone, that water would rise up right to the point of the water in Levy's Prairie. That's the potentiometric surface. Then when we get over here to the sandhill lakes, that whole string of them, right, that Alligator Creek hooks together, that's these guys over here. Okay, next slide. Another slide of potentiometric surface. So the water goes in way up there where the aquifer is open at the top. It comes flowing on down here. It can't get through this stuff. This stuff is an aquiclude. It's impermeable, right? Water won't go through it. You punch a well, you punch it up there, it's just at the water table. That water's not under pressure yet. It's starting to get under pressure down here. It comes up this high. And when you get down here, here goes the land surface. The potentiometric surface is above. The artesian surface is above the land surface, so the water flows out of the well. And the way they map, they make maps of the potentiometric surface, and we'll look at one here in a second. What they do is they go all over the place and they measure the height of the water in those wells. That's how far it's coming up into those pipes, right? And it's just like making a contour map, a conventional one, like you get a quad sheet, right? The mountains have all these contours. Just same with the water surface. Okay, next. And here's Florida. This is a potentiometric map, what everybody calls a pot map. And this, if you were looking at a map of hills, you would say, oh, well, here's a big hill, right? Look at this, 120 feet, 110, dropping down this way. Well, this is actually a map of the pressure surface in the limestone. So if you put a well in here, water can come up to 120 feet. This is the green swamp. You may have heard talk about that as one of the really important recharge areas. Well, that's why. And then you come on up here, and here's another one. A little high. It doesn't show as much on this particular map, but we're sitting right on it. Water that goes into these lakes and stuff around here, particularly these sandhill lakes, because most of those reach the aquiclude. So rain, the fall, it gets into the lake, goes on down to the aquifer, then heads out in pretty much every direction. A lot of it towards Jacksonville. And it's hard to tell on this, but, well, next slide. There's a big old hole in this potentiometric surface near Jacksonville. This is just a blow up of one over in Suwannee County. So here's the 50-foot line, here's the 40, and so forth. So water flows across those lines and downhill, just like it does up on the surface. Same thing on the ground. Next slide. This is one, these pot maps are really useful. And here's one reason. Here you guys are, here's Keystone Heights, here's your lake right down here. Here's the potentiometric high, right? 80 feet, 90 feet. Water that's getting in the ground here flows in this direction, this direction, this direction, this direction. This is a hypothetical map before Florida was developed, potentiometric surface. And this green line right here is what I want you to pay attention to. Water from this line, on the right side of this line, the east side, flowed towards the Atlantic Ocean, Jacksonville, Fernandina. On this side, it flowed towards the Suwannee River drainage, Isostatic River. Same at Keystone, water going that way and water going this way. Now let's look at the next map. This is after, this was done in 1980, and the line that divides water going this way and this way has shifted all the way over to here. And this colored area is the area that now no longer feeds the springs and the rivers and the stuff into the west. It's now going this way to Jacksonville. And you see that big hole in the potentiometric surface? That's not a hill or a dome in the surface, that's a hole in the surface. Those are the big pulp mills in Fernandina. And if you have a pot map on up the coast, the Florida aquifer goes all the way up to like Hilton Head, South Carolina. And if you look at those maps, there's a big cone of depression in Brunswick, Georgia. They got pulp mills, and then you go to Savannah, and you really got a monster of a hole in And they have actually dropped the pressure surface in the Florida aquifer 50 miles inland, all the way on up, like over 10 feet. So here we got probably the finest aquifer in the world. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. It's probably the best aquifer in the entire world. And we're working on kind of messing it up. It's quite a feat, actually. Okay, next. This will give you an inkling what's going on with that last slide. These are the water withdrawals and 3 of the rural counties to the west, Columbia, Union, Baker, and Swanee, 4 of them. And here's the water withdrawal for Duval and Nassau County. That's Fernandina and Jacksonville. That's up. They've gotten a little more efficient here, huh? Now they're going back up again, but that's like 530 cubic feet per second. Silver Springs right now is probably flowing about 350 cubic feet per second. That's a lot of water, right? So they're drinking a couple of silver rivers every day. Jacksonville. They are very thirsty over there. When you put these wells down, you got that tensiometric surface, that water surface down there. When you suck water up, it causes a cone of depression. So you get this it's like a ice cream cone, an empty cone, right? It's shaped like that. And that cone of depression goes over 5 miles out to sea in Fernandina. The only reason they don't have this incredible saltwater intrusion is because of that Hawthorne formation that we're sitting on right here, right? We got 100 feet of it. So they got several hundred feet of it over there. And that keeps the salt water from moving down into that limestone and into their wells and ruining everything, right? Ruining their aquifer. Next. The problems with these sandhill lakes over here, Geneva and the rest of them, the DuPont mine catches a lot of flack about that. I've heard a lot of people think that the DuPont mine does it. I haven't studied this really carefully, but I really don't think it's the DuPont mine. Next slide. These guys used to be really wasteful of water at the sand mines, the titanium mines. First they would just find big hills, right, and mine them away. Then they would dig further down, and this is water table. And they would put pumps in here and just pump it away and down Alligator Creek or wherever it was they could get rid of it, right? Peace River, depending on what part of the state you're in. Then they started doing a thing where they would let the water fill up in their hole and they put dredges in. That's a big suction pipe. They just suck stuff off the bottom of the pond, right, of the lake, and pump it back over here where they treat it and get what they want out of it, and then discharge it to a creek somewhere. But now what they do, and I mean they were catching so much flack about being wasteful with the water, that they kind of mended their ways. They still have the lake. By the way, this lake moves. They'll work on this edge here, and they'll go that way, and they'll pump the sand back over there, and now the lake is over here and not over here. So they travel around the landscape. First thing they do is cut all the trees down, get the stumps out, and then dig this lake and put the barge in, and that's how they mine. But they recycle the water. Okay, next slide. Over in these sandhill lakes, we've got, this is what it's like right over here, 2 miles away. The potentiometric surface, that artesian surface, there's clay. The artesian surface is down here. It's below the bottoms of these lakes. So water wants to go down. And if it gets a break in this clay, that's what it does. But you also get, like up in these high sandy hills, they're full of water, right? They're what they call their superficial aquifer, the aquifer on the surface. And water will move kind of downhill in those things, and it goes towards these lakes. And it says here, superficial aquifer springs. And so what you get is seepage into the sides of these lakes and into the bottom. They call them springs, but that's kind of a stretch. And I'm sure you've all experienced this, and you maybe said the words yourself. I've got an uncle or a friend of my uncle put on scuba gear and went diving in the lake, and there's a big spring down there. Well, there's not a big spring down there. There can't be. It's physically impossible because of this, the potentiometric surface. There's no pressure to shove that water up. Okay, next. We're in a recharge area, especially right over there to the east. And the potentiometric surface is below the level of the lakes. It's actually a good bit further down than that. But this is the only diagram I could find. And so water wants to go down. It doesn't want to go up. In a discharge area, they say lake, it's almost never lakes. It's almost always a river, right? St. John's River, that whole river is a zone of discharge because it's topographically low. You know, when you put a well in, it can reach the surface real easy. Okay, next. And there are those sandhill lakes over here, and here's your lake. And it's quite different than those. Oh, there was a move afoot a number of years ago to dig a canal in between Lake Santa Fe and Lake Geneva, is the first one, the lowest one. And bad idea. I had another slide that didn't make it in here and showed all these relative lake levels. Geneva's lower than Santa Fe. It would have just flowed right on over. And you know, Geneva's like the bottom of this Alligator Creek drainage way, and water's going down in every one of those lakes. We'll talk in a minute how they prove that's actually happening. So when Alligator Creek flows, water gets into the lake, but it's going down. And that's one reason these lakes dry up so much, and Lake Santa Fe doesn't. They have this extra added way to lose water, which is down to the aquifer, and Santa Fe is sitting up on that nice chunk of clay. Okay, next. This is from further south, but this same photograph would hold true right over here in the Sand Ridge, right, in the Lake District. These are all sinkholes. Every last one of them. I mean, they got the classic look, right? And there's thousands of these things dotted across the trail ridge and the ridges further south. Next slide. And this is Lake Santa Rosa. I think they just call it Lake Rosa now. Obviously a sinkhole. And look at this. This is over at what do they call it? Cowpen Lake, off 26, 20. Sinkhole. All of them are sinkholes. And these lakes right over here by Keystone kind of look the same way. When they get really low, they turn into a series of little ponds isolated from each other. Each one of those was a sinkhole. Next. Lake Brooklyn. When I was a little kid, I remember driving across that arm up there where the road crosses, and Lake Brooklyn was dry as a bone. It was impressive. I still remember that like it was yesterday. So that was in the 50s, the great touchstone drought. We had a huge drought in the 30s and another big drought in the mid-50s. All these things dried up. Silver Springs, which used to flow about 800 cubic feet per second, dropped down to 600. That was the lowest that had ever been recorded. Well, we're working Silver Springs over now. It's down around 300. It actually went to 250 cubic feet per second. And by 1960, the rains had returned. All these lakes filled back up again. Silver Springs went back up to its former mega flow, and everything was all right. But what seems to be happening now is the rains return, and the lakes and the springs, the flow doesn't come back. There's a lot of people that think it's overpumping. I guess I'm kind of in that school of thought. The water management district's working all kinds of models right now, and I was talking to one of their guys, and he's saying it's not overpumping. It's 97% drought, like for Silver Springs, and 3% overpumping. And well, he's going to have a lot of convincing. Silver doesn't flow as much as Rainbow anymore. They're like sister springs on the big pump of limestone on both sides of it. Rainbow now flows about 100 cubic feet per second more than Silver. And one of the people there's this Adina Ranch that wants a whole bunch of water. They've hired some hydrologists that say, oh, well, there must have been a cave collapse, and now the water is being diverted over here instead of the Silver, and it's not overpumping at all. But anyhow, what these guys did, go one slide forward. They came up with this simple but ingenious little device. It's a 55-gallon drum. You cut the bottom out of it. You put a little valve up at the top that you can hook a balloon to. And you take that drum and you shove that open end down into the sediments, into the bottom of the lake. And if water is coming up through the bottom of the lake, seeping through the bottom, that balloon gets bigger. And you can measure how much bigger it is over a unit of time, right? And you can calculate how much water is coming into the lake via seepage. You can also do the thing for seepage out. The balloon gets smaller, right? So go back to the last slide. Well, that's what they did here. They put them all over the place. And they know for a fact they've actually gone out there and they look at surface features, that they know there's like a sinkhole down below. And they actually drug ground-penetrating radar around to verify these places. So there's sinkholes out here, and this is one of them. And that's where they kind of expected that a lot of the water was going to be lost to the lake at. Well, it turns out it wasn't true. Where most of the water is lost is around the edges and in the shallow part, what we call the littoral zone, the part we swim in. And what's going on here is that over time, these lakes build up sediments in the deeper part. And by sediments, you know, muck, mud. That's the layman's term. And that stuff seals the bottom of the lake. And so, but these lakes fluctuate like mad. And so what happens is when the edges of the lake are exposed to atmospheric oxygen, all that muck and stuff oxidizes away, just the slow burning fires of oxidation. And so it doesn't build up. And everybody loves to say, I live on a sand bottom lake. Well, they live on a sand bottom lake for a reason. Things fluctuate. If they didn't fluctuate, it would be sand bottom. There would be organic materials all built up on the bottom of the lake. So what they found was lots of water going down into the bottom, around the edges. They had one place in the lake, right here, where water was coming up consistently. And then over here, this is where one of the sinkholes was, and when they first put their things down, they got no water leaving the lake, right? It was just zip. Nothing happening there. So then, they had the same rig, but they took the top out, so they could take the top off, and shove it in the bottom, and reach down there and dig 60 centimeters or so of the muck out of the bottom. And then they put the lid back on, and they put their balloon back. And before the balloon was even on, they saw water rushing into their 55-gallon drum. So that proved that that mud and stuff on the bottom of the lake is keeping those lakes up on the surface. If that was all gone, I suspect those lakes might just disappear completely. And there's kind of a feedback loop going on here. You know, as it gets further down, you get more into the muck, and then it slows down the drainage out of the lake. Because you're exposing less of this and this more on the peaty bottom. Okay. Next slide. Sinkholes get villainized, right? I mean, sinkhole. Me and a handful of friends are probably the only ones in the state that would love to have sinkhole on our place, right? They took my house. I wouldn't care. It's like, well, maybe I would, but if I had a really big backyard and I got a sinkhole out, I go, this is terrific. Because this sinkhole formed down around Orlando, Winter Park, in 1981, and here it is in 1994. There are lakes in the making. So that's probably the potentiometric surface down here somewhere, even probably further below it, right? That artesian surface that water wants to rise up in from the limestone. It's probably sealed off the bottom by now, and water is perched up above that. So you got a nice little lake. Next. Okay, that's all the science. So let's just take a look at what's down below the water. This is a sinkhole over in Madison County, and it gives these are windows to what's going on down below. So let's take a peek at what it looks like down below. Typical cave. This is actually kind of small. Some of these things are as big as this room right here. And next. And there's sand on the bottom. But all this limestone, you'll never see a band of sand anywhere, ever. I've been in lots of these things, and I've never seen that. So there was no sand around when this limestone was being formed. That all came washed in from the surface. And these lakes and all that we've been just talking about, that have these imperfect connections with the aquifer, Well, when those things collapse down, they're probably all full of sand. There's so much sand right over here, right, that it just fills these things up. So there won't be anything like that. The nearest thing to it is double sinkhole over towards Interlochen. That's like 120 feet. Has a little cave. Next. There's probably 5 million years of limestone right here that these guys are dropping down about a 100-foot shaft, and no sand layers, just that pure, like ivory soap, 99.9% pure limestone. Next. And some of these things are really big. Someday that's going to fall in. I know right where that is because we put a little beacon down there, and a guy on the surface radio located it, and it's like 60 feet below the surface. Someday that's going to erode out, and there's going to be another lake out in the woods, right? That roof will collapse. Next. And next. Oh, I just threw this in because it's so cool. This is down in Orlando. This used to be really common. They would have what they call drainage wells. So let's say you got a lake and you don't want it to go any higher than this. So what you do is this happens to be a 12-inch well. You drill a big old well down into the limestone. Now this, you already know from your lecture that the artesian surface has to be below the bottom of the lake or this ain't going to work, right? So when the lake rises up and starts flowing into the top of that pipe, it goes down into the limestone and it puts a limit on this lake. Kind of like having a creek. It won't let it go any higher, right? But this particular well started acting up, and this is our old faithful. It would over and over again blow this geyser of water up 25 feet into the air, and then it would calm down, and then you're gurgling and all sorts of stuff, and then boom, off it would go again. And it became a huge attraction, right? Everybody came to see this. Pardon? You know, I don't know which lake that is. I should have gotten that. But people speculated as to what's causing that, but nobody really knows. It's probably got something to do with a little side chamber, and you know they don't case these wells all the way. They'll put a casing on them so far, and then they'll leave them uncased. And it could be that there's a little side chamber somewhere. The air is getting entrained in and packing into it, and they go boom. But who knows? Okay, next. That's it. And you can see it looks kind of like sinkholes, doesn't it? But I'm not going to stick my neck out and say that it's formed over sinkholes. There's your legs. That's it. Questions?
When you feel the currents coming up,